won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time? Oh, talking with the angels. Won't it be a time? If you know it, you can help me. Say it one more time. I'll say, won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time?
Shalom, saints, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to go ahead and say shaloms all around to everybody who is in the live chat. I see Sandy C. and Modern Moralist. Thank you both for being here. See a couple other people who have not made themselves known, but nevertheless, I get the little tab here that says you're watching. So thank you for watching if you're here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time that we go live. Remember, you can leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. And if you're here live, you can leave any of those here with us live as well. But as per usual, when we have guests on and a set topic and stuff like that, we probably won't get to the things you guys are asking live. The exception to that, of course, being I will honor anybody's super chats, right? Obviously, if you're going to take time out of your day and money out of your pocketbook to support what I'm doing here, then yeah, I'm not going to ignore your question. That would be very rude of me. So on that note, if you'd like to support the work that we do here, there are numerous ways you can do that. Obviously, I just brought up super chats, super stickers, super thanks, anything of that nature, as well as channel memberships. Buttons for all of those things are in the live chat. If you'd like to support on Patreon, you can give any amount that you like monthly on the Patreon. Fun fact, if you give $5 monthly in our Tea Party tier, then you will become you join our Tea Party tier, right? Then you get access to the Breakfast Tea video blog that I do, which if you're familiar with like Blog and Mayblog or Jared Longshore or anything like that, it's basically the same style as that, right? I write out a little small article, essay, if you'd like to call it that. It's really not long enough to justify being called an essay. And then rather than having you guys read it, I read it for you. And again, that is extra content for about $5 monthly. We post bi-weekly. And the most recent episode, which I posted this last Saturday, was on whether or not faith is good. Because believe it or not, there are Calvinists out there, anti-Calvinists, excuse me. There are anti-Calvinists out there who want to argue that faith is not good, which I don't even really know how they begin to argue for that. I mean, I do in the sense that I've read it, but I don't know how you rationalize that in your head. Anyway, not the point. If you're interested in the video, it is up there on Patreon. I got tons of links in the description. I got a link to both my other two channels, my political channel and my music channel. I got links to my paper, which we're going to be talking a little bit about here today on the DoD deception argument. I got links to my book, 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered, links to all my different social media, as well as the PayPal and Patreon, and link to my guests' academia.edu page, which while I'm on that, I'd like to personally recommend his paper on 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, which I think absolutely destroys the idea that 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 demands a libertarian free will view. To be fair, it's not really making a metaphysical claim, period. But nevertheless, a lot of people want to argue that it demands a libertarian free will perspective. And I think Colton Carlson does a really good job demonstrating that is not actually the case. You can have multiple ways of escape without a libertarian view. Great paper. Please do check it out. Link is in the description below. Other than that, I don't have anything as far as links and all that jazz. One thing for channel housekeeping we want to get to, which is this. I will be posting the debate I recently had with Elijah Yossi. If you've already seen it, it's over on Standing for Truth's channel. Great channel. Subscribe. Nevertheless, I'll be posting it on this channel probably today or excuse me, tomorrow or Tuesday. We like to give 2 weeks or so for everybody to check it out over on Standing for Truth's channel. Obviously, he hosted it. He's the one who organized everything, so we want to make sure he gets a decent number of views. But then once we get far enough away that his views will start slowing down, we'll post it on our own channel. We're about at that point. So I'm going to post that probably here sometime soon. If you haven't seen it yet, you'll see it here probably tomorrow, Lord willing. If you have, but you want to watch it again, certainly appreciate you. And obviously, I am always covetous of your criticisms, whether good or bad. We have a debate coming up June the 24th. That is going to be with Chris Morrison on the subject of James chapter 2. There is no thesis. We're just discussing James chapter 2. But he is a free gracer, and I would be identified with what you'd call the Lordship group. So that is, I guess, kind of your thesis, right? What is the best exegesis of James chapter 2? Something along the lines of Lordship or something along the lines of free grace? I think that'll be an excellent conversation. Chris Morrison, in my own opinion, will probably be the best free gracer I've ever debated. I've debated Charles Jennings a couple times. With respect to Jennings, he's just not a great debater, to be honest. He's a cool guy, but he's just not a great debater. And then I debated this other gentleman whose name I don't really remember. Gibbs, that's what it was, Joshua Gibbs. He actually is a very talented debater. And actually, that was on James chapter 2 as well. So that'll be some good competition, a good video watching if you want to watch that as well. Of course, it's not always about the competition, but it is good to have, people who are better at debating. I'm sure Charles is getting better as well. I think one of the problems with me debating Charles was I was like his first or second ever debate. So not even necessarily his fault. Anyway, tangents aside, we have that coming up June the 24th, 6 p.m. Mountain Time on Standing for Truth's channel, so be sure to check that out. I don't really have anything else for channel housekeeping. So the last thing I'll say is Happy Ascension Sunday to people who celebrate. Ascension was technically last Thursday, May the 29th, but a lot of people wait to celebrate it on Sunday. So Happy Ascension Sunday. Obviously, this is the holiday that celebrates the ascension of our Lord and Savior. Also, for those of you who celebrate biblical holidays and or are Jewish, like myself, Chag Sameach. It is officially, now that it's evening, the first night of Shavuot. So, celebration of the first fruits. A lot of people also think the celebration of when the law came down on Mount Sinai. Considering the symbolism you see in Acts chapter 2, I think that's probably true. But nevertheless, to all who are celebrating, happy holidays, happy Ascension, Chag Sameach. We obviously appreciate all of you guys being here on your holiday. If you are celebrating, and if you're not, well, then appreciate you being here. Anyway, that's pretty much all I got for channel housekeeping. So let's jump right into our prayer, and then we'll get into this video. I think we're going to have a very interesting video for you guys today. So, let's just jump right in to our last channel housekeeping item, which, of course, is a prayer. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you once again for this opportunity to make these videos, Lord Jesus. I want to pray that we use this time to glorify you and to edify your body. I want to pray that we have your anointing here today, Lord, that we be good stewards of your word and of the intellects you've given us, Lord, both us here in the video as well as those in the audience. Help us to be zealous for the truth, defensive against all lies, and careful to explore everything here with trepidation and with accuracy. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name and give you the glory. Amen. All right. So I would have my guest do an introduction, but I feel like at this point it might be a little redundant considering he was just on quite literally last Monday. But nevertheless, Shalom, Colton. Thank you very much for being here. Anything you'd like to say about yourself, of course, you certainly can, but you don't have to.
No, it's a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you for having me. I don't need to say much. I think most of the guests probably know who I am, and all my work is linked below. So, thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you. Always a pleasure to have you on. We are doing another Stratton review today. This will be actually our last one. Well, I mean, not perpetually. We'll see what happens there. But he did like 5 videos. Might have been 4. But nevertheless, responding to some of the stuff we were talking about, we reviewed 2 of them last week. We're going to review a third one this week, and then the other 1 or 2, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2, But nevertheless, part of the reason I can't remember is because really not relevant. We won't be covering it. It's kind of just repetition of the stuff we're already talking about here anyways. So that's what we're doing here today. The topic is actually the deity of deception argument, and specifically, can the Bible be trusted if divine determinism is true? Spoiler alert, yeah, it can. But we're going to go through exactly why that is rather than just telling you, yeah, it can. Trust me, bro. And we're going to be doing so by reviewing this video Stratton came out with called We Can't Trust the Bible If Determinism is True. Now, I'll be making reference to a paper of mine. For those who are in the live chat, I think I already said this, but just in case I didn't, that paper on the deity deception argument, why Dr. Tim Stratton's DoD argument fails, is linked in the description below. So we're not reading the entire thing here, obviously, right? If you guys want to read the entire thing, you can. Link is in the description. You do. I'm pretty sure you have to download it in order to get access to it. But nevertheless, or at least in order to get access that's functional. But nevertheless, we'll be making reference to that paper on top of reviewing this video, and of course, reference to numerous other works as we continue to go forward. So that's everything that's going on. Do you have anything to add before we jump into the video?
No, let's go for it.
Awesome. Let's get right into this. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And of course, we want a full screen. All right. Here we go.
That might come across, or that I've come across, says, I don't like how Tim argues, because if I accepted the fact that God was a deity of deception in a negative way, in the sense that he's blameworthy for determining falsehoods or something like that, to his believers, his fellow believers, then yeah, that would be wrong. So what do you have to say about that? Like that response?
Yeah, well, I just say that it's irrelevant if this Calvinist subjectively likes how I argue. I mean, what's important is if the premises of my argument can be shown to be true or even probable.
I actually started this a little bit too early. We didn't want to address this part. But for the record, I'll just say I agree with that. It's not relevant whether or not somebody likes the way you argue. But I actually was intending on starting a little bit later precisely because I don't care too much about that. Colton, if you want to add anything to that, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead here real quick.
No, I don't know who he's talking about. I don't think either of us, maybe Date, perhaps, if he's still responding to the original video, but I don't think we've ever said that, oh, I don't like it, so therefore, or something germane to that. So I'm not sure what he's responding to, but I agree with you.
Yeah, and actually, same. When I was going through this the first time, I was kind of curious. Doesn't sound like, I'm not going to say nobody said it, just because sometimes, right. You make sweeping claims, and it turns out that some guy's actually very loudly saying.
Well, I think it might be something along the lines of he's intentionally pushing intuitions, and so in that sense, I think it might have been Date where he doesn't like the way he argues, and I'm hardcore paraphrasing.
Right.
So if we were to backtrack, I think it had something to do with that. But then if that's the case, if that's the context, well, then I kind of agree. I don't think you should intentionally, or I kind of ironically, deceptively pump the intuitions in your favor in order to show how your argument could be right, and then your opponent is wrong, or your interlocutor's responses could be wrong. I think that is not dialectically fair. But I'm not sure. I think it's irrelevant overall because we don't know the context. So if that was the context, well then, Stratton might be wrong that it's not necessarily irrelevant. But since we don't know the context, I'm willing to grant that it is irrelevant.
Right. And actually, that does remind me, one quick note I want to bring up, because there is something we'll be getting to a little bit later. I guess it could be, I had in the original video with you and Chris and Israel said that I feel like the deity of deception argument is kind of a appeal to emotion. In other words, it's not so much meant to get people to think as much as it, and I still kind of believe this, by the way, as much as it is to get people to have like a visceral reaction against Calvinism. And if that is the case, and Stratton knows his own heart, I don't, but if that is the case, then obviously that is a terrible way to argue, kind of the antithesis of logic. Nevertheless, that actually comes up a little later, so I won't go into more details about that.
I do think, though, Stratton relies much more in his arguments on not necessarily logos or ethos, but a whole lot of pathos. I think a lot of his arguments are embedded with pathos. And I think that you need all three, of course, as Aristotle said, to be rhetorical and to try to persuade others, right? But too much of one thing is gonna seem fishy to me, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so ethos without any logos or pathos is just not even a paper. It's just informative, right?
Yeah.
Ethos with logos and no pathos is robotic and mundane, and you're not going to persuade your audience. But too much pathos might persuade your audience because we are emotional people after all, as Hume said, right? But it's not going to necessarily have any long-term bite, I don't think. And if it does, it's not well suited to stand long-term. Not to say that that's what Stratton is doing, not to say that his DoD argument is like that. It's just kind of putting it into context. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And like I said, we will get a little bit more into that here later in the video, because that actually, as its own separate block, comes up.
Yeah.
But I think I have skipped ahead to the proper part. So here we go.
I think part of the problem here is this assumption that it's an attack of God's character because we say stuff like you cannot trust, things like that. And we think, well, that means he lacks character. That's not the type of trust. Now, we could get into the character issue if we want, but that's not the type of trust you're talking about. You're not talking about trust because of character. You're talking about trust because of consistency. What's determining you to think a certain way? How can I really trust my mental faculties? It's the same thing you use when we talk about naturalism, right? So it's like the reason you can't trust your reasoning processes isn't because your brain is evil, because your synapses are firing in an evil way. It's because it's untrustworthy. So I think that's
So, but yeah, you're right. I'm not attacking God's character here any more than I'm attacking the character of physics and chemistry. When I say, look, if physics and chemistry is determining all of your beliefs about metaphysics, then you can't trust your beliefs about metaphysics. It's not because physics and chemistry is evil. It's just untrustworthy to deliver truth regarding metaphysics. And so if your idea of God is that he determines all things, then even if he's morally perfect for doing so and has great reasons and intentions for doing so, well, now this deity is because all these Christians and everybody else affirms contradictory theological beliefs. Now we're in a position that where we realize, well, even all these epistemic peers and all these Christians, even Christian philosophers having all these different ideas and beliefs. Well, if God is the one determining all of these, even for a really good reason, now, even if we're not attacking God's character, so I'm not saying God's evil here, it's just we realize that God is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs because we realize.
All right, so recap, because you kind of went a little bit in circles there, but nevertheless, what he's essentially arguing is to say God is untrustworthy in this sense is not necessarily to argue that he is untrustworthy in character, right? Like that it's a character flaw, but more to say that he is an unreliable source of information, right? And that the argument is supposed to be focused more on him being an unreliable source of information than it is to be focused on him being somehow morally deficient for being deceitful or something like that. Now, I actually have two major issues with this point. The first being, I just don't think that Stratton's being entirely forthcoming, if I'm being honest. For one, if you read his original paper with J.P. Moreland, which, by the way, if you watch Stratton and you haven't read that paper, I don't know how you've managed to avoid it because he references it constantly. But if you have read that paper, then you know that one of the themes in that paper, I wouldn't call it a central theme, but it's certainly a theme, is Stratton. He consistently says, how do you distinguish between a deity of deception and a Cartesian demon? Right? For those of you who do not know, Rene Descartes came up with this idea that it's at least possible that all of his senses could be deceiving him in the same way that that occurs during a dream, right? Obviously, you can sometimes even get such a real dream that you can taste things, you can smell things, stuff like that, right? But it's not real. And he's saying there could be some very powerful, omnipotent, even demon that has caused my senses to operate that way all of the time, and I would have no way of knowing. And this has come to be known as a Cartesian demon, at least in some circles. And Stratton, in the paper, asks the question, how can we differentiate a Cartesian demon from a deity of deception? Now, if that doesn't sound like an attack on God's character, I'm not entirely certain what an attack on God's character is. Because, I mean, you even use the phrase demon, right? Not that he came up with the Cartesian demon phraseology, of course, but nevertheless, you know, that's clearly an attack on God's character. So I don't think Stratton's being entirely forthcoming when he says this isn't about God being trustworthy. The second problem here is, and we've talked about this before, Colton, but if somebody deceives me with a just purpose, and we're going to get more into this later as well, because we're going to talk a little bit about certain believers in Scripture that I would argue God is deceived. And I know that person has just reasons, then actually, I think I have every reason to trust that person, even if that specific bit of information is still wrong. And there's a third point I want to get to, but I want to let you comment if there's anything that you want to comment on before I get to that last point.
No, I will let you go on. I just want to preview that my general response, because as we kind of go through, you know, this video, he's going, I mean, the premise that he always wants to press is premise 2, which is essentially that, you know, if determinism is true, then we can't trust God because we can't have knowledge, right? It's not a reliable indicator of knowledge, right? And he kind of hinted at it right here, right? It's not a reliable indicator of knowledge. And so if determinism is true, I can't have knowledge. But then the contrapositive is knowledge, therefore indeterminism. But then we're back to square one, really. How do you get that consequence? And why does epistemological concerns regarding the access of justified true belief knowledge require metaphysical access to certain beliefs? And that is really the core of the argument here, right? So if we strip it all down to the bare bones, that's what he's going to try to argue, is that knowledge, therefore indeterminism, determinism, therefore not knowledge. I can't trust anything, so therefore I can't believe what I believe to be true. It's an untrustworthy source. That's very important, and that's why I said I wanted to preview it, because when it comes back, we're going to start seeing some of his support systems for that premise, knowledge, therefore indeterminism, specifically for the consequent, the indeterminism piece. And we're going to see that it's very hard to shove a metaphysical support system, an epistemological framework that requires nothing for metaphysics. So I agree with virtually everything you said. I just want to preview that. The only other thing I would say is I want to be kind to Stratton here and charitable. I think he would say, yes, generally the source is untrustworthy if that source has deceived you, but only for that thing that he deceived you in.
Right.
So I think, to be as charitable to Stratton as possible, although, again, he hasn't really quite made that exactly clear over the years. I think the first time he has made it clear was just on like a month or two ago in a video, and then it clicked in my head. I was like, oh, that's what he means. He doesn't mean that the deceiver, the determiner of deception, is completely and utterly untrustworthy. He just means it's untrustworthy for that belief. I still think that if he presses that response, there's a host of consequences that are like terrible and awkward for both indeterminists and determinists to take. So I still don't think it's overall a good. I still think the argument fails, and I don't think that's a good response. But I think let's be charitable and let's kind of go with a razor's edge and try to get exactly what he's trying to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree with that. And I want to piggyback a little bit off of something you said there, because my third point actually was, he talks about untrustworthy in the sense that the information that he's a unreliable source of information. And we can even whittle that down, like you just said, unreliable source of information as it pertains to this particular thing, right? Say God has determined you to be deceived about eschatology. Well, then God's an unreliable source of information regarding eschatology, right? The issue with that, and it is an issue that we'll get into more here and that I write about a little bit here in this paper, is that determining somebody to do something is not the same thing as doing something yourself. So if I am deceived, and we can come up with any number of reasons why I'm deceived. Maybe I have an emotional attachment to a certain argument. Like, so let's say I grew up in the Mormon church, so I have emotional attachments to Mormonism. My family's Mormon, let's say my wife in this hypothetical is Mormon, all this other kind of stuff, right? The source of Mormonism or arguments supporting Mormonism or arguments against Mormonism in that instance is not actually God. So to say, what I mean is, and I'm speaking as if I'm Stratton, what I mean is that God is an unreliable source of information. Well, there, I feel like you're conflating primary and secondary causation, because the secondary causes, the direct causes, are actually the sources, as far as you're concerned in your real experience, of the information, right? You're not deceived, whether that's, again, your faulty reasoning or some kind of emotional attachment or incomplete access to the data or whatever it happens to be. The source of information isn't actually God in those scenarios. So to say this renders God to be an unreliable source of information, I think it just doesn't follow. It sounds to me like a non sequitur. And I think we'll be able to see that more plainly as we go on, because I am kind of holding back a little bit for sake of the video. But that to me seems to be a major, major flaw in the deity of deception argument, because it does not follow that if God determines you to lift weights, that God is a personal trainer. You know what I mean? Somebody said, I can't say that God is a weightlifter, because we're not saying determining X makes you X, but the determining X makes you like a procurer of X. And that's fair. But nevertheless, that God determines you to drink does not make God the bartender or something along those lines, right? So I think that's a fairly big flaw in the argument, and I think that as we go on, we'll be able to expose more of why that is a big flaw in the argument. But you saw him mention it here a little bit.
As well, look at all of these committed and mature theologians with all these contradictory beliefs. Whatever is determining, there's no support for premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever,
a little bit too far.
No support for premise one of
in some nefarious way, whatever. Now let's look at the argument, and they say, well, there's just no support for the first premise of this argument.
Well, that's like saying there's no support for premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, sure, maybe there's one counterexample out there, but no one is aware of anything that begins to exist without a cause. So yeah, show us what this is. I mean, because nobody is aware of anything that begins to exist without a cause, just simply saying, well, maybe there's a counterexample out there. Well, okay, possibilities come cheap. What is it? We don't have an example of one. So, so therefore, the first premise of the Kalam is at least probably true. That is to say, it's unreasonable to reject it. So, I've heard this objection too many times, recently from a Calvinist on YouTube. So for this YouTuber to reject the first premise of my argument is quite telling. It really shows how powerful this deity of deception argument is. I mean, remember, the first premise is simply this: if Ed is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs. Now,
first of all, I don't know if it's necessarily right to call you a YouTuber. I know you're on YouTube, but I think most of your work is actually probably outside of YouTube. I don't link to a channel. I link to academia. Nevertheless, I'll let you take this one first. Go right ahead.
I think, first of all, I mean, I'll be honest and transparent. I really don't find the Kalam even like convincing. So like, I mean, that's just me, right? I would rather take Rasmussen's contingency argument, or really, if you want to go old school, Leibnizian contingency argument, or versions thereof, are where I would probably lay my gold. Or maybe a teleological of some sort, right? Irreducible complexity, stuff of that nature. The Kalam cosmological, I think it's too simple that it can't get off the ground. You have to have so many other, this is kind of a rabbit trail, but you have to have so many other arguments in support of a small argument to begin with. It just doesn't, to me, I don't know. Now, of course, much smarter men than me, as like William Lane Craig, others like Jacobus Erasmus, one of Stratton's best buddies, who's done a lot of papers, EPS papers and stuff, published papers with him as well. Like, I know that he has an entire book like on the Kalam, right, defending the Kalam. And so I get that, right? So I'm saying this with a grain of salt, but I just never find it really convincing in the first place. I do grant that, yes, let's look at the first premise. Anything begins to exist, doesn't pop into existence. Things that begin to exist has to have a cause. They don't pop into existence. I get that, and I think that is probably true. And so in this case, looking at the first premise of the DoD, I think it is probably true that there are no Christians with a perfect set of theological beliefs. I think it's probable, definitely. I still don't see, though, based off of that probability, why I should just grant it. And again, I would mirror it with the Kalam, because it's not exactly yes, it is more probable than not. To me, there's still some wiggle room there. Atheists have literally try to argue against premise one of the Kalam. That doesn't mean that contrary to Stratton, that the argument is so good. I don't know why he's saying that. I have no idea why he's saying that. Just because you're attacking premise one, right? It just means that they're trying to poke holes into the argument that it's not necessarily justified. And just because something is completely probable doesn't necessarily mean that is perfectly justified, generally, right? So I'm painting with really big, broad strokes. I get that. So everything I say is a grain of salt. That said, I really don't know if it is absolutely improbable that God can't just determine someone with a perfect set of theological beliefs. In fact, in other words, to put differently, I think it's more probable that God would determine, or God could determine, or that there is an actual, or has been an actual person who has determined, let's say, in some possible world with a perfect set of theological beliefs. I think that's more probable than the denial of premise one of the Kalam. So I get what Stratton's trying to do. He's trying to kind of compare the two and the probabilities, but I don't know if the probabilities are exactly the same. Just personally. And, CJ can say more on this with regards to the apostles and those who've actually written the Bible. And I think that's a pretty, they seem to have a really strong set of theological beliefs. Are they perfect? May or may not. Right. But, and the last thing I would say is, I think if determinism is true, then and God has determined all humans. Well, Jesus Christ is a human, so we're getting into some fishy waters, right? Was Christ himself determined to do what he does? Does he have a perfect set of theological beliefs? Seems like he does, right?
Right.
And so if he does have a perfect set of theological beliefs, and there is a human there that was determined to have a perfect set of theological beliefs, seems like the argument's busted at the very first premise. So I think that at the very least, there's more discussion to be said here in premise one. I don't think it is enough just to say, these guys, they don't know what they're talking. I don't know if he's actually meaning to say this, but generally, these guys don't know what they're talking about, or that's ridiculous. It's definitely improbable. Blah, blah. I think there's at the very least some discussion here that needs to be had, whether that's from Stratton or someone else. I think there's good discussion in premise one, and I don't think we can just throw it to the layman, to the audience, and expect everyone to believe it.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Now, I will say I tend to like the Kalam a little bit better than you might. So maybe that's even a good thing, because his little analogy argument, we have somebody who doesn't find it convincing and somebody who does find it convincing, but we both agree on the actual substance of rejecting the first premise of the DoD. So maybe that wasn't a great analogy to use, right? I would just point out briefly on the Kalam before I get to these other two, and you can, correct me if you think this is wrong, even if you don't want to get too tangential, but I'd just say, it seems to me like the premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause. To deny that might be to either create, you would have to come up with some other kind of a scientific theory, right, that explains how something can both begin and be uncaused, right? Because as it stands right now, I don't know if it's necessarily logically impossible, but it does seem to be physically impossible. Now, with that being said, the reason I point that out is because there is no impossibility in God determining somebody to have a perfect set of theological beliefs, whether logically or physically, right? So in other words, it's disanalogous. Regardless of if we accept the Kalam or not, the Kalam is at least relying upon a certain kind of not mere improbability, but impossibility, which may or may not be true. Whereas the first premise of the DoD does not actually, how am I trying to word this? It is neither impossible physically or logically that somebody has a perfect set of theological beliefs. Therefore, it's just not comparable to the Kalam cosmological argument. To argue against the Kalam, and you or somebody else might do this, you would have to argue either A, no, it is physically or logically possible, which somebody might do, totally possible, or B, it just doesn't prove that a God exists. With that one, I've seen very, very common, right? A lot of atheists will say, grant the whole thing, where do you fit God into the picture? And actually, that's a fair rebuttal, if I'm being honest. So beyond that, though, why would we agree on the substance regarding the DoD, specifically premise one? Well, there's a couple things. First off, I can't stand this whole likely true thing. It seems to me like I go on a whole spiel about this. So if anybody's interested, link below. But deductive arguments rely on certainty in premises. That's the whole point of a deductive argument, is that if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows, right? All men are mortal. J is a man, therefore J is mortal. Now, watch what happens when I add just one little word into there and how it no longer follows, right? All men are mortal. J is probably a man, therefore J is mortal. That doesn't work, right? Because I've said J is probably a man, and from there I can conclude J is probably mortal, but I can't conclude J is definitely mortal because the second premise is in question, right? And this, I think, would probably more fit into the realm of inductive reasoning. Not that big a deal, except for the fact that Stratton, I think, is putting a lot of rhetorical weight behind the deduction element of, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows, therefore determinism is false if the premises are true. And if this is actually more of an inductive argument, and I could be missing something on this, then It could be a good argument, but it no longer guarantees the truth of its conclusions, and I might actually be able to grant every one of your premises and not your conclusion. It also seems to me like if I'm right, I want to keep prefacing if I'm right, because I'm not yet a PhD holding philosopher, Lord willing soon, but nevertheless, it seems to me like a very basic error to make. So if it is the case that Stratton is mixing up I learned this in Philosophy 101, you know what I mean? So if he's actually mixing these two things up, that would be one of those, like, you don't want to talk to people who are laymen. You're arguing kind of like a layman. That digression aside, he says it shows the power. It's likely true. Is that the case? Well, let's just go through a couple things. Logical possibility, right? Square circles. Those are logically impossible. 2 + 2 = 5 is a logical impossibility. Technically, it would be a mathematical impossibility, but that fits into the category of a logical impossibility, right? A married bachelor is a logical impossibility. Logical impossibilities can't even be conceived of. I'm saying this for the audience. Not Colton already knows all this. He could probably teach me, to be honest. So is it logically impossible? Is it impossible to even conceive of a human being having a perfect set of theological beliefs? No, it's not. Okay, so move that along. It's perfectly reasonable to imagine a situation where somebody has a perfect set of theological beliefs. In fact, we all grant it with Jesus, and I think most of us are pretty sure that we'll have a perfect set of theological beliefs on the other side of eternity. So we all actually grant that it's possible at some point. What about physically impossible? Physical impossibility implies, how am I trying to word this? Come on, Jay, seriously. Physical impossibility is things that violate certain laws of science or laws of physics, right? So, like, I can't fly without unaided propulsion, right? That's physically impossible because I don't have wings or jetpack, strapped into my body or something. So, is it physically impossible for a man to have a perfect set of theological beliefs? And again, the answer is no. It doesn't violate any known laws of science. It doesn't violate any known laws of physics. So you can at best be saying it's statistically unlikely, or you can say even though it's possible, it's just simply not true, right? Like it can totally be possible that I don't have a pen in my hand, but I do have a pen in my hand. It's a terrible example, but I couldn't think of one off the top of my head. To which then I would go to the point about counterexamples. I don't know if it is true that there are no counterexamples. I don't know for a fact that the apostles or prophets did have a perfect set of theological knowledge. But I think it's at least reasonable that, for example, Moses, who knew God as a friend and talked to him face to face, see Exodus, might have, or Deuteronomy 34 is another example, might have been right about every theological question of his day. I think that's at least reasonable as a possibility, right? Ditto with somebody like Paul or John the Baptist or something like that. Now, did they? Maybe, maybe not. I guess I can't say definitively that they did, but considering you're writing scripture and talking directly to God, and anything you do get wrong, you can just, knock, knock, knock. Hey, God, what's the answer to B? You know what I mean? It seems to me to be at least reasonable that that they had the correct answer to all theological questions of their day. And if somebody says, well, yeah, but what if they're ignorant about some question that didn't arise in their day? I don't know if that suffices, because you're saying false theological beliefs. If I don't have a belief regarding something, like if I'm not yet aware that the earth's shape is a question, and so I don't have a belief regarding the shape of the earth, I don't know if you can say I have a false belief regarding the shape of the earth. I just simply don't have one, right? So I don't think we can grant it. I don't think it's logically impossible. I don't think it's physically impossible. I don't think that it's a proper use of deductive arguments. And I think that it's at least reasonable to suggest that some of the apostles and prophets, that's not even considering Christ or considering those who raise up in the last day, may have had a perfect set of theological beliefs, which means if that's true, you have to reduce this, or reword this is actually the better way to put it, to what I call the Bob problem. And I say that to be humorous, but nevertheless. The Bob problem is Bob has fault. Sorry, let me restart. God determines everything that comes to pass Bob has false theological beliefs. Therefore, God determines God determines Bob's false theological beliefs. My apologies. Right? The exact way I worded this, let me just read that because it'll sound better, and that was just atrocious. Premise 1, God determines everything that comes to pass. Premise 2, Bob's a loyal Christ follower. Premise 3, Bob has at least some false theological beliefs. Conclusion, therefore, God determined that Bob, a loyal Christ follower, would have at least some false theological beliefs. Conclusion 2, therefore, God determines that at least some loyal Christ followers would have at least some false theological beliefs. That is the point he's getting at. It's not the point that he made, though. Instead, he made an exhaustive point that I think can be very easily rebutted. And as we continue on, we'll see that even the Bob problem doesn't work, in my opinion. But I think it's worth noting, even if we can steelman Stratton's argument to say, okay, this is the crux of what he's saying, which is that if any Christian has any false theological belief, God determined it on determinism. But that's not actually what he said. And that's an important part of these arguments. You have to structure your argument in a way that is valid, that is sound, that is cogent if you're using induction. You can't just say, well, yeah, but what I really meant was, because, okay, yeah, but that's not what you really said. Structure the argument the way you intend it to be communicated, and then we can talk. Sorry, go ahead. Talk for a minute.
No, I had nothing else to say. I love it.
Thank you. All right. So I think we're actually done with the no support for the first premise, but let me play here for a little bit and see if there was anything else he added that was important.
That follows after one affirms both, one, that God determines all things, and two, all Christians affirm at least one false theological belief, if not multitudes. So that's the typical position of the Ed Calvinist, the Calvinist who affirms exhaustive divine determination or determinism. So unless this guy truly believes that there's some infallible super pope out there who never gets theology wrong, that there's this super pope out there somewhere walking this planet, then he's got to say that every Christian and everybody else.
All right, yeah, we're pretty much done here. He's just repeating.
At least one, if not more.
Sense that you can't say that if God determines us to be deceived, then God is a deceiver. There's no way to support what you want to say, that God is therefore untrustworthy. But then we're back to the original question: what would make God untrustworthy? And then he says, of course he's not. So yeah. That's something that I ran across with, and this seems kind of. Well, no, I'll let you cover it. Because I have my own thoughts. But why don't you? You're the expert here. Why don't you? Go?
I mean, really, that seems like a desperate attempt at playing a semantic game in order to try to escape the main problem here and the main point of the argument. So, look, it logically follows that one, if God determines all things, and two, all people affirm false theological beliefs, then God determines all of our false theological beliefs. So if God determines all Christians and everybody else to affirm false theological beliefs, then, as I said earlier, God is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs, even if it's for morally sufficient reasons. So I refer to a personal being who is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs, the most important kind of beliefs, right? If Christianity is true, and it is. So yeah, let me back up. I refer to a personal being who is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs and determines everyone to get ultimate reality wrong as a deceiver. I refer to that personal being as a deceiver, but the argument passes no matter what you call this supernatural deity, right? Call him a god of mischief like Loki, or whatever you'd like. I don't care what you call him, but the problem still remains. So if God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate all humans to possess false theological beliefs, then it's warranted, or it stands to reason to infer and refer to this deity as a deceiver. But call him whatever you'd like. If we call this being a deceiver or call this being a schmeceiver, it doesn't matter. The problem still remains. So here's my message to these Calvinist determinists, to these Ed folks. Stop trying to avoid the main point and the thrust of my argument and just deal with the epistemological problem that this argument exposes. I mean, yes, if God caused.
All right. So
for the record, I am so much less of a determinist than CJ is.
that's actually true.
So if he wants to, and on that panel, I was, if you recall, CJ, I was like the only one to say that I am not confident in my belief that determinism is true.
Mhm.
Whereas Israel, Chris, and yourself all said, no, I'm very confident that determinism is true. So, I mean, I will go on the record and say I don't really classify myself as a determinist any longer. I am just strictly agnostic. I don't think that if determinism is true, it would be problematic. And I don't think if indeterminism were true, it would be problematic in any way, shape, or form through God's providential systems or anything like that. So I just want to go on the record and say that. So I'm defending determinism here strictly because I do not think that it is problematic, though I don't necessarily endorse it myself. Though I will endorse the fact that I think it's probably the best providential system.
Yeah, funnily enough, I actually got memed on that same video because my answer for what I was least confident in, I am a compatibilist, but the thing I'm least confident in about Calvinism is actually free will. I'm not certain we have it. I believe we have it at this current stage, and I did then. And like I said, I got memed for saying that, but I don't know. It's true. So yeah, Colton's entirely right. I am much more of a determinist than he is.
We are flipped. So anyone who's listening, I'm much more of a compatibilist. I strongly believe that we have free will. I strongly believe that we are morally responsible. I just don't think determinism or indeterminism are problematic to that free will. So
yeah, exactly right. So this is the most irritating part of the video, in my opinion, because he takes an objection that I think is a death blow and then says, I wish you guys would just deal with the objections. He just dismisses it. It's completely like, it's a game.
We can get into the weeds of epistemology. I can't wait. So I'll let you go to town and then we'll go into it. But
absolutely. So let me start off by saying this is dealing with the argument. Stratton here, and I don't know if he's being duplicitous or if he's just not taking the objection seriously. But regardless, in dismissing the argument and saying, I wish people would just deal with the argument, he's essentially saying, I won't allow you to respond back to me with anything I think is or with anything you think is worthy, because I don't think it's worthy. And that is not the way that these discussions are meant to take place. Secondly, again, briefly, semantics matter. Okay, semantics matter. I can't call this the God of cheesecake argument, okay, because cheesecake means something. So, when people, well, it's just semantics. Yeah, well, semantics are important. And again, Dr. Stratton, of all people, should be very sympathetic to my semantics matter point, and anyone else who would make that point, because he is huge on the personal pronoun arguments, right? And I don't disagree with him, by the way. I'm just simply pointing out, if semantics don't really matter, then who cares if you call Tommy a she? Okay? So it's just a word game, right?
I would also like to point out he's also huge on specifically advocating for the exhaustive part on the definition of Ed.
Right. Which is another semantic.
It is semantical to him. And so he's like, this matters in the debate because it brings meaning, semantics brings meaning and textual meaning to everything else. Great. So does this.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And thank you for bringing up that example, because that's actually probably even a better example, because it's actually germane to the topic. Now to the actual argument. Those are just two little soapbox points. To the actual argument. So the argument is that God determines you to do something is not the same thing as, or to be something. I'll fill in the blanks here so it sounds better. Is not the same as God being adjectival form of that something, right? Yeah. In other words, And this is the example that he used. I'm going to use another example, which I think is much stronger, and I've actually gotten some endorsement from professional philosophers on. That God determines you to drink beer does not make God a beer drinker, nor does it make God a beer seller or somebody who produces beer or a bartender or anything of those of that nature, right?
Right.
In other words, to say God determines all to be deceived, therefore God is a deceiver and cannot be trusted, that's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. Now, my example that I used here in my paper, which again, I've actually gotten some support from professional philosophers such as Dr. Sean Gould and the University of Nevada, Reno professor, whose name I believe is Dr. Klein, if I remember correctly. I did not know, I only met him through academia, but nevertheless, he was quite fond of this argument. There's an old argument. Let me give you some context here, guys. It's all going to make sense. There's an old argument called the idol argument that was presented against Stoic determinism way back, 2,300 years ago, if not longer. But the first time we actually have it recorded is back in Cicero's day, which is around 2,100, actually. But I digress. The idea behind the idol argument was if you are determined to get well, then it doesn't matter if you go to a doctor or not, because you're going to get well. If you go to the doctor and you're determined to get well, you're going to get well. And if you don't go to the doctor, but you're determined to get well, you're going to get well. So who cares about going to the doctor? That's the point of the idol argument, right? Now, the rebuttal to that argument was it could be that you're co-fated to get well because you have gone to a doctor that has the answer to your ailment, right? Why do I bring this up? Because this shows us the distinction on determinism, because an indeterminist can say primary and secondary causation exists. But this shows us how on determinism, primary and secondary causation can work, right? The primary cause can determine that things take place through secondary causes, or to put it another way, God determines both the means and the ends, right? You've heard probably Dr. James White, R.C. Sproul, a bunch of other famous Calvinists make arguments like that, right? Now, all of that is to say, Stratton has very clearly, in my opinion, confused the difference between primary and secondary causation here. Take the doctor analogy as an example. We agree that God has determined me to get well, and we agree that God has co-fated, as Cicero said, that I go to the doctor who has a cure for my ailment, okay? So we all agree on that. We're not going to try and retreat here and say, well, yeah, but you going to the doctor was determined too. Granted, it's part of the argument, right? Does it therefore follow that God is the doctor? The answer to that is obviously no. In fact, it doesn't even follow that God is a doctor, right? It simply follows that God has set up the antecedent conditions necessary to guarantee I go to a doctor who has a cure for my ailment. That's all it means, right? You can't add to that. You can't subtract from that. That's the definition of what it means. So what Stratton is trying to do in this deity of deception argument is essentially argue God determined you to get better, therefore God is a doctor. And that doesn't logically follow. It confuses secondary and primary causation. Now, because Stratton has made this argument, Stratton's third point, which he has not yet gotten to, goes on to say God is deceitful and his word cannot be trusted, right? But if we can't grant that God is deceitful because we can't grant that God is a deceiver, then in what way does it follow that his word cannot be trusted, or that our beliefs cannot be trusted, or that he's an unreliable source of information? And by the by, on that point about him being an unreliable source of information, again, this confuses primary and secondary causation. Stratton at no point in his argument has made clear that God is the one who's deceived. Rather, what he has argued is that God has determined one to be deceived. And I know that might sound like semantics to people, but as we just demonstrated, I think it's a very important distinction, right? Because if God was directly deceiving me, say I get my eschatology wrong and God has determined my eschatology be wrong. Maybe I'm a pre-mill and it's on-mill, or I'm an on-mill and it's post-mill, or I'm a post-mill and it's a who cares, right? If he said hey, Jay, postmillennialism is true, and it turns out amillennialism is true, then yeah, you can say at that point, God is actually a deceiver, and I am not in a position to trust his words, even if he did have a morally justified reason for telling me that the wrong millennialism is true. But that's not what Stratton's arguing, and it's not what Calvinists believe, right? Rather, people who get a wrong view about eschatology, they can have various reasons for why they have a wrong view about eschatology. Could have, like I said, a certain emotional attachment to the arguments. They could have deficient information. They could have poor reasoning skills. Think of any other reason you can possibly imagine. There can be tons of reasons, but not included in those reasons are God actually told you the wrong answer was the right answer, right? So, again, if we have a solid understanding of primary and secondary causation, then we can't conclude that God is the deceiver. If we can't conclude God is the deceiver, we can't conclude that he is deceptive. And if we can't conclude that he is deceptive, then there's no reason to grant that the Bible cannot be trusted or that God is an unreliable source of information. Sometimes when I talk, I think I'm clear as mud. So I hope that was at least a little bit clearer than mud.
I think it was more clear when you finally got to the punchline.
Okay. Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Honestly, I was just about to say, well, he's not arguing that, if God determines us to drink beer, then he is a beer drinker. He's not arguing that. But then he related it back to deception. And that's when I was like, oh, that's brilliant. Because, looking at premise 2, he does say God is deceptive, which I have to assume, based off of the title, the deity of deception, that he wants to say God is a deceiver.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it is very good. Just because God determines deception in his believer, in his, all Christians, whatever, doesn't mean that he himself is a deceiver. And if he's not a deceiver, then I don't understand how he could be deceptive. But then if he's not deceptive, then I really don't see how the Bible cannot necessarily be untrusted. Cannot be trusted. Yeah. So I think it's brilliant. It's not the route I would go, but I think that is a perfectly valid route. And full stars, 5 out of 5.
I appreciate that. I think I'm a little bit clearer of a writer than a speaker, so it's probably better in the paper. But nevertheless, I appreciate that because, yeah, like I said, sometimes I get it from my dad, man. My dad goes on these massive tangents of conversation, and I have 100% taken that from him. Like somehow telling you how NASCARs are related to the Pixar movie Monsters, Inc., and we're going to go through cars or, you know what I mean? Just some nonsense. But anyway, on to the point. So if you wanted to add anything there, you can. I am actually done with my little soliloquy. Actually, I had one more point. He says any name works. Well, actually, that's not true. That's part of the semantic game because, again, we can't call this the God of cheesecake argument, right? If you're actually making the claim he is a deceiver, so if you can't defend that he's a deceiver or mischievous or what have you, then obviously the argument falls apart. No, not any name works. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I might save my big epistemological reveal, which, if anyone follows my work, it's not really big. It's very straightforward, and it is virtually a copy and paste from my volume 2 in response to Stratton's free thinking argument, because he unpacks the same kind of support systems, even though the DoD is not the same thing as the free thinking argument. In order to support that infamous premise 2 of the DoD argument, he has to rely on metaphysics, I think, and his reliance on metaphysics and ability, as I previewed like about half an hour ago, that is where he's going to get into trouble, I think. So I might save to reveal that, but I will say I think his response right here falls exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to the pathos, and not like he's just pumping rhetoric here, like literally pumping rhetoric. And it just bothers me. I love rhetoric, but the way in which you pump rhetoric, if it's too much pathos or too much ethos and logos, it's not helpful. right? It's just not helpful at all. And especially if you're pumping the pathos, you just sound like a salesman. And it really bothers me here. So I'll say that that's my own, you know, I guess,
Yeah.
tongue-in-cheek response, but we can move on.
Yeah, and I'd agree a lot with that. I'd want to briefly say, because you brought up the free thinking argument, that's exactly right. In fact, the DoD argument is originally given in that paper that Stratton always references is actually not on DoD. It's on the free thinking argument.
Yeah, yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I just want to briefly plug, I don't know if I know him well enough to call him a friend, but nevertheless, David Paulman's Why I Don't Use the Free Thinking Argument video. If you haven't seen that, check it out. I think that's a brilliant video. Paulman, it's funny. Everything I agree with him on, I agree with him on 100%, and I think he's awesome. And everything I disagree with him on, I couldn't possibly disagree with him more. But anyway, it's a brilliant video, guys. If you have time after this, check it out. Kind of a beast of a video, but nevertheless, I mean, all of his videos are. Without further ado, then we'll go ahead and continue forward with this video.
Determines all humans to drink beer, then it does not logically follow that God is a beer drinker himself. But, however, I did say this on another video. If God causally determines all people to drink beer, then it might make God guilty of procuring for minors, but that's another conversation, So anyway, this is a feeble attempt. And really, these feeble attempts really show how powerful the deity of deception argument is. The Ed advocate must resort to semantic games instead of facing the defeaters that are right in front of their face and that are punching them in the face.
Now, I think that those were faced pretty head on. The reason I decided to include that part is just because I wanted to point out again, it seems like Stratton's response to these arguments are, well, the mere fact that you addressed it proves that it's right. And it's like, okay, I mean, if that's the goalpost, then I guess I can't possibly kick a field goal because that's just too far out of my reach.
It's just, to me, it's very, because I think the free thinking argument, to borrow from my dear friend Jonathan Thompson, who used to actually write for Free Thinking Ministries, but then him and Tim had a falling out that's pretty well known on the online community. So I won't get into that, but he argues that the free thinking argument is just an ambitious transcendental argument. I mean, at its core, it is a transcendental argument. It's trying to prove something transcendental.
Right.
And transcendental arguments are notoriously linked, not always, but usually are linked to presuppositional apologetics. Now, I have no idea what kind of apologetic, CJ is in, and that could be an amazing conversation. Perhaps.
Probably.
But I am not a presuppositionalist, and so that probably helps in my disdain when it comes to his defenses here, because he's defending the premise and this idea of like the feeble attempts just goes to show how strong the argument is. I mean, that's what a presuppositionalist will literally say on like the side. I've literally heard Jeff Durbin say something like that to like a Mormon. Or like an atheist on the side of the road, or same with James White. Like, it's just, I won't get into it, but that's just kind of bothers me. I think that kind of rhetoric is only pronounced in presuppositional transcendental argumentation, and that's why, because the discussion can't really get any further. Because then it's like, oh, I guess I can't say anything because anything I say just somehow vindicates the argument. What the junk? How does that even work? It only works when it comes to transcendental arguments, and that's why I really do not like them.
Yeah, and if I may, I'd like to briefly add on to that, just because I think that I am a presuppositionalist. I say technically because I think presuppositional arguments. Real quickly, I just got to say, I actually agree with everything you just said, which might sound confusing to people. How can you be a presup and agree with everything?
I do think presup arguments, transcendental arguments, get a bad rap. I will say that. So
yeah, it seems to me like presuppositional argumentation should be limited in arguments regarding, like, for example, epistemology or the grounding of knowledge, right? Like, I don't need to, I can argue like an evidentialist against somebody trying to demonstrate that God exists or trying to demonstrate that a certain moral precept is correct or something like that, right? I don't think you need to go to the precept route for that. To me, the precept argument is just simply like, how do you ground the existence of logic? And honestly, outside of a topic like that, or a topic like how do you ground the existence of morality, I don't think anybody should be a presuppositionalist. And that's why I say technically. I'm technically a presuppositionalist because I think it's necessary for logic and stuff like that to ground things in a God. But if we're not having a conversation on specifically that topic, you would never know I was a presuppositionalist, because that's the only time I feel like that argument even is supposed to come up. Roundabout way of saying, I actually completely agree with you. It's unnecessary to be, and it's overly confrontational too, right? You're not getting anywhere. You're not convincing me. I'm not convincing you. And, I love James White. He's one of my favorite apologists, but that's a flaw, I think, in his argumentation, particularly as it pertains to atheists. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And, I'm sure Stratton is not a presup because they tend to almost always be Calvinist.
He is absolutely a classical apologist. Maybe with some evidential leaning, but he's gonna essentially whatever. I venture to guess whatever William Lane Craig is. That's probably what Stratton is, because that's what he has his master's from Biola, and that's exactly what Biola teaches. So they have classes criticizing presuppositional apologetics. So.
And with that, I think he's pretty much done on this section. At least done with the things I wanted to get to. The Bible states episodes of deception, so this is a whole Christian problem. Yes. I love this part. Guys, this is my favorite part of the video. I'm actually not kidding. I'm being completely unironic right now. Now, it's my favorite part of the video because it's so absurdly wrong. But I love it. It's fantastic. Yes, I'm being confrontational. But, brother, Tim, ever watch this? My guy, I am certain, 100% certain, that you can come up with a better argument than you're about to, because I've watched it happen on numerous other areas. So don't take this as me like diminishing you as a person or as a scholar, because I actually happen to know for a fact that you're a better scholar than this. But this is terrible, man. Let's get into this.
To us.
That's
so,
right.
Anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
You're right.
Yeah, so another response that I've heard is someone that said, I don't think this is a particularly Calvinistic deterministic problem. I think this probably, or could be broadly, a Christian problem, especially if the Bible clearly states episodes or scenarios of divine deception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard this many times, and I'm just going to say that's false. I mean, not only have I heard it many times, I've explained this many times. So here we go again. In Scripture, God only allows deception to those who oppose him or who are in sin as then an act of judgment. So as I recently explained at the EPS, at the Evangelical Philosophical Society, I gave a talk about this. And I said, look, if somebody, or if one examines his or her life and does not see a commitment to living in sin, then one doesn't have justification to believe that God would determine him to be deceived about theology and ultimate reality. If, however, one comes to see that he's made something an idol, I've been in danger of that before and been convicted on that, really had to deal with that. In fact, I think people often make theological positions idols in their lives. So, I mean, perhaps somebody has made Calvinism or determinism their idol. Then one has reason to doubt their beliefs about reality. If one is actively in sin, and we know that God allows people who are in rebellion or who are idolatrous to be deceived, and you recognize that you are in sin or worshiping an idol of some sort, then there's reason there's warrant to think, wow, maybe I might be in a position where I'm affirming all this, these false beliefs because God is allowing that as an act of judgment. So again,
all right, You guys ready for this? This is actually really simple. Now, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of those mountains of which I shall tell you.
Yeah, I think it's very.
That's
very
it. That's my whole argument right there.
And honestly,
Yeah.
I think he has tried to respond.
It's just false.
Yeah, I think he with maybe CJ, you remember? Did he try to respond to the Abraham passage with Jonathan Pritchett?
Yes, he did.
I don't remember him saying much.
His argument was essentially, or his response, and I actually get the feeling that was the first time he had heard it because it was very off the cuff. But the response was essentially, we don't know whether or not Abraham was deceived regarding his theological beliefs about God. But you can't name any other instance, right? Which, to be fair, I can actually. I can name 2 other instances, and I might in a minute. But also, that's just such a horrible argument, right? Like,
and we don't even need any other instance. We only need one counterexample. So like, it doesn't even matter that we have any other. I originally read the Abraham example, and it's one of those things that are so in your face that you don't really think about too often. But then when it gets brought to light, you're like, how could I be so blind for so long? It was Eric Weilensberg's essay in the New Essays on Skeptical Theism that I think was published in, I don't know, 2010 somewhere. And his essay is Divine Deception. And he argues that this is a case of divine deception. And then he goes on to argue that this is a Christian problem, right? That we really don't, if there is cases of divine deception with Christ follower, God followers, I guess, because, technically, I guess Abraham wasn't a Christ follower in the literal sense since he didn't know Jesus Christ, but God follower, even God followers can be deceived, and for good reasons. And so I think this is a very important passage that, man, Stratton needs to spend a little bit more time on, my friend.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And you notice now there are 2 different issues here then, right? Not only do we have the problem of determining deception does not make you a deceiver. So the whole foundation of this argument doesn't work. But also pushing that off to the side, it's also just plainly stated that God does deceive people sometimes.
Right.
And I know somebody might, point to like Numbers 23:19, God is not a man that he should lie. I believe there are good apologetics for that. I'm not here trying to tell you that God is a liar. He is not. I'm not going to go into that right now because I think it would be probably an hour-long video in and of itself to study all those things in context.
I would say, just real briefly, I think the easiest solution to that would be lying entails deception, but deception does not entail lying.
Exactly. And I completely concur with that. I think that's an 100% correct statement. And it would be, I think, the foundation of any apologetic regarding this issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the Abraham example, it's clear as day. God misleads Abraham into believing that that God wants Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac when God, in fact, does not want that.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing that makes this such a poignant example, because the whole point of this thing is, well, if God deceives, then we can't trust him regarding certain things. Abraham actually has the exact opposite view as Dr. Stratton. If you go to later down in Genesis 22, Abraham says, I and the lad shall return to you when talking to his servant, probably Eliezer, but I don't know if it actually mentions. My camera keeps going off. I don't know why that's happening. At any rate. So the implication there definitely being Abraham thinks he's coming back down with the kid. Come on.
Yeah.
But then Hebrews 11 also tells us that Abraham was so confident that he thought Isaac was definitely coming down with him, even if it meant that God was going to resurrect him from the dead. So what's my point? God is using this instance of divine deception not to demonstrate he's not trustworthy, but actually to demonstrate how trustworthy he is, right? And Abraham is so confident that God is, in fact, the trustworthy being that he's saying he is, and that Abraham believes he is, that he's like, yeah, I'll do it. I'll plunge that knife right in there because Isaac's coming down with me. I am certain of it. And for the record, just because I teased them, I will briefly mention some other examples. God deceives the disciples in that he gives deliberately vague and confusing parables that they do not understand, so that they will come and ask him, while false believers will leave, saying, essentially, this guy's a kook. See Matthew chapter 13. He also deceives Israel by way of omission, by not allowing Israel to know he is the Messiah and the Son of God. See, for example, Matthew 16 and Matthew 18, where he tells his disciples, and numerous other places as well, where he tells his disciples, hey, don't tell these people the things that I've told you. Or when he heals the demoniac, same thing. Tells them, don't tell the people the things that have happened here today, right? Trying to deliberately hide these things, which is a kind of deception. Now, perfectly holy reasons for doing that. He's not lying. And in fact, it doesn't even mean none of those people were saved. Tradition records in both the Orthodox and Catholic Church, and it's because of a pretty strong historical argument, that Nicodemus became a Christian after he died. Personally, I happen to believe that. The Bible never says it, but I think the historical argumentation for it is pretty good, and the traditional argumentation for it is pretty good, although in my opinion, kind of the same thing. But if that's true, it means that one of the people that Christ deliberately hid stuff from, by way of parables and by way of telling people not to go talk to them, was a future Christian, i.e. Nicodemus, at the very least. Joseph of Arimathea also was a Pharisee, so you could just use him as an example, and you don't even have to speculate, because Joseph of Arimathea clearly was a Christian. So that's just 3 examples off the top of my head where God plainly, clearly, obviously, and blatantly deceives believers who nevertheless trust him anyway. And in fact, God uses that to demonstrate just how trustworthy he is to those who are called according to his purpose, to kind of paraphrase Romans 8:28. So, yeah, I don't think, with the utmost respect to Stratton, I don't think this could possibly be more wrong. I actually don't know if it is possible. If I paid him and said, come up with something that is more wrong than what you just did, he would have to give me my money back because he can't do it. Anyway, if you'd like to add anything to that, go right ahead.
I think that maybe he forgot, but I am pretty sure he is aware of the Abraham passage. And to me, that's a nail. I think that it clearly states that divine deception is there. I would encourage Stratton to read Eric Weilenberg's essay on divine determinism or divine deception. And yeah, he definitely argues that deception is probably inherent, not just a problem for all Christians, but intrinsically inescapable for Christianity, and I guess really religion in general, right? Because I think he's an agnostic, if I believe. I'm not exactly sure on that, but I'm pretty sure. And so that's why he's like, even if skeptical theism were true, this is still a problem that skeptical theist, because it is an anthology on skeptical theism, that essay is in, they still would have a problem of divine deception, even granting skeptical theism for, evil. And so, yeah, this was a really low point, I think, in the video. I don't think he's articulating our responses or the interlocutors, the opponent's view wholeheartedly here. So,
yeah, and I absolutely agree with that.
And I can grant everything that he said too, and I still don't think he gets it right. Well, in response to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just briefly reiterate one last thing before I press play, which is just to say, you now have, beyond the fact that first premise has just been outright rejected, and I would also point out the first premise is neither falsifiable nor provable, but I digress. I should have said that earlier. But you have on one end, you can't actually demonstrate God as a deceiver by way of him determining deception. And then on the other end, you actually have to deal with the problem that God is a deceiver anyhow, because notwithstanding these arguments are terrible, in my opinion, he still has clear instances of deceiving believers. So from both ends of the theological hammer and nail, so to speak, or rock and a hard place, whatever you want to say. I don't know. I'm not good at analogies right now. Stratton is getting hit, and I think it's a big deal. I personally think the DoD argument is something that should and hopefully will go by the wayside in the next decade or so. I don't think it's a particularly good argument. I don't love the free thinking argument, but to be honest, the free thinking argument is at least better than the DoD that is within it.
Yeah. I can't remember if the video, I want to relate the two together in a bit. So I'm kind of curious. I cannot remember if he does relate. So maybe we'll see. There's the appeal to emotions. So if he doesn't, then I don't know. I might have to just go for it, but I kind of want to see what else we have, and then we'll go from there.
All right. I feel like he does, but it's definitely not in the blocks down here, so I'm going to have to find it.
So I'm not sure. So
again, this is another good reason to strive to hate sin and live according to the law of Christ. I know I'm not perfect, but man, I strive to do that. And that's also why I surround myself with people who, like you, Josh, who hold me accountable, and others who definitely aren't impressed by Tim Stratton in any way. My wife is number one. And so many of you keep me accountable. I try to return the favor, but the more we're seeking God and seeking Christ and seeking truth, Jesus is the truth. If we are committed to truth, we see no instance in Scripture where God starts making people believe lies who love Him and are seeking Him.
Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Let me in. He's willing to let you in. In Hebrews, God is a rewarder of those who earnestly seek Him.
Yes.
And so
He's not giving him any false theological beliefs.
No, he's not. So
point.
Anyway, that's where my next portion. There are people, and I know, Tim, that there are these people because they have said it to me without you knowing, that might say things like, well, it seems like Tim appeals to emotion or gets emotional or appeals to emotion when he's making these arguments. What would you have to say to people who levy that claim towards you?
I would say, look, I get it. This argument can touch some nerves, as it were. But look, all I'm doing is seeking the truth. So if a view makes it impossible to possess knowledge, then as Victor Reppert has noted, this view is a prime candidate for rejection. So my argument is simply based upon logic, and it's not emotional. What it does do, however, is show that Calvinists who are not willing to give up their view in the face of a defeater are probably too emotional about their dearly held beliefs. It was hard for me to give up Calvinism because so many of my pastors and favorite authors were these Calvinists, and I was kind of raised in that environment, and plus I just thought for so long, so many years, and I gave sermons on the topic about it. I thought it was true, and it wasn't just a assent to a proposition. It was I did have some emotional attachment to it, so it was hard for me to let it go when I finally realized and saw all these problems with it, really problems that I think ultimately make it a different gospel. But my argument, I'm not trying to touch people's nerves or pull their heartstrings or getting emotional with them. I'm simply trying to be logical.
So many things to say.
Yeah. Actually, you go ahead and go first.
Well, I'll say one thing, and then I want you to go, and then I'll go in for what I wanted to say for most of the video. It's not that we, and I'm speaking for CJ, but I'm sure he's going to agree. It's not that we are holding onto the grit of our teeth, right, to an argument in the face of a defeater. My friend, obviously, if we thought it was a defeater, we would give it up. The fact is, we don't think it is a defeater, so therefore we're not giving it up.
Exactly.
Really bizarre dialectical sentence to say, don't you think? Right? It's almost painting us as completely irrational when it's couldn't be further from the truth. If we thought it was a defeater, then sure, I am almost positive we would give it up. In fact, I mean, again, I'm not speaking for CJ on this. I am speaking for myself. Because of all of the arguments in favor of compatibilism that I have found, and not as much argument for determinism, at least philosophically and biblically, that is why I'm currently agnostic. I've switched my view over the years from being a thorough theological divine determinist to I'm simply agnostic with regards to divine determinism. I just don't think it would be problematic. And in fact, most compatibilists, contemporary compatibilists, are like that. So like I'm thinking of John Martin Fisher or Sartario or McKenna. If you ask any one of those compatibilists, if is determinism true? And they're all, secular compatibilists, so I don't think they believe in God. But I could be wrong. I do know that John Martin Fisher is agnostic. He's a agnostic Jew. But if you ask all of them, hey, do you believe determinism to be true? All of them would say almost unanimously, probably not. But even if it were, it is not problematic. And that's the compatibilist view. And that's the view I hold. I think there's better reasons to hold to that view rather than the view that, yes, God exists and he does, in fact, without doubt, determine every single thing. And I'm sharing that bit about myself because I agree if there are, or he says defeater, I'm just going to say lack of evidence or evidence to suggest a different view. Obviously, the rational person should accept it. So I don't think he's doing this intentionally, but it does seem like he's painting us or whoever he's responding to, Calvinists, in a uncharitable light, thinking that we'll hold on to something, the skin of our teeth or the grit of our teeth, whatever, even if there is all this evidence to the contrary. No, my friend, that's not at all what is happening. We just don't think the evidence you presented is any good. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, and how much study into Calvinism and all that Stratton did while he was Calvinistic, I don't know. I'm not going to say one way or the other, right? I will say, though, that I have the reverse thing going on where I was, and this doesn't mean anything, by the way. I hate when people use this as an argument, but it is nevertheless just a brief anecdote. I was very much opposed to Calvinism until around 2020, actually. I thought that I thought that determinism made God worse than the devil. Right, the famous John Wesley quote. I wholeheartedly believed that, and it was on the basis of what I saw in biblical and philosophical evidence that I became a Calvinist, and in terms of our question, a compatibilistic determinist. Right, so. Now, that does not mean I'm right, or that Colton's right, or that we're collectively right when we agree, or any of that stuff. It simply means that this, as you say, right, this idea that we're just holding on to this dearly beloved system, right, it's just not true. As you say, if I thought it was a defeater, I'd change my view. I've been presented with other things I thought were defeaters and have changed my view. And maybe somebody wants to point out that I was, 21, 22-year-old kid back then, but guess what? I'm only 27 now, so you're not going to get too far with that one. I don't think that the arguments are convincing, right? Now, the point I wanted to make here, because I am one of those who has accused Stratton of and he's actually responded to it directly when he was talking with Dr. Pritchett in their response video. I have been one of those who's accused Stratton of arguing in a way that is pathetic. And I stress that word path in that because if I say pathetic, we have the modern day connotation there, which is not what I'm trying to say. But overly emotional, right? I think that because part of the reason I think that is because I could imagine a scenario in which the deity of deception argument was true and God still exists, and it just so happens that he's a deceiver, right? Like it doesn't. If I were to grant that God is deceitful and that he can't be trusted, that doesn't actually mean that A, he doesn't exist, or B, he's not deceitful, or C, he can't be trusted. It just simply means that he, as we already said, can't be trusted, right? It's a so what kind of argument, in other words. And I understand, like he said earlier, well, any view that renders epistemological knowledge impossible is prime for rejection. But of course, there are many philosophers out there who don't think that knowledge is possible. In fact, skepticism in its purest form is the idea that knowledge is not possible. Now, I want to be very clear to the audience. I don't believe that at all. I am very much, if I had to pick a camp, I kind of like elements of both the rationalist and the empiricist. But if I had to pick one, I'd probably be close to the rationalist guys. If for no other reason than Leibniz is actually my favorite philosopher. But that being said, it's entirely possible that God could be a deceiver, that he can't be trusted, that I can't trust any of my theological beliefs, and that Calvinism is still true. So the only real reason this argument gives you to reject it is that you don't like those particular facts. And that's if you grant that as being 100% true. Now, I don't, and we've demonstrated throughout this video that we have good reason not to grant the argument, right? In fact, I think we could just toss the argument out whole hog. But you have to demonstrate for me that this is a problem for Calvinism outside of simply that doesn't sound good and I don't like it very much. Because if that's all you got, well, it's entirely. I use this example sometimes when I'm talking about Calvinism with people because they'll say, they'll always mention some egregious, terrible thing of some like child abuse. Are you saying God determined child abuse, right? And right, exactly. And before I actually get to answering the question, because I think there's kind of a wrong attitude in the question, I'll often say, look, guys, God is God. He can do whatever he wants. If he decided he was going to save every purple panda born on the 7th Tuesday of September and then laughed hysterically as nobody met the qualifications, he could do so. What are you going to do? Tell him no? You know what I mean? Now, God is not capricious like that, and I don't think God would do anything like that. He's not irrational, anything like that. But the reason for bringing that little quip up is to say, you can't just say, I don't like that. That makes me uncomfortable. Therefore, it's not true. That's not how logic works. That's not how theology works. It's not how philosophy works. It's not how knowledge works. So that's why I think that this argument is overly emotional, is because I don't think it actually gets me to a place where I have to reject determinism. I think at best it can only get me to a place where I want to reject determinism. And that's, again, if I grant all the premises as being true.
Yeah, I would say that, Justin Capes actually has, I think it's a terrible article. I love Justin Capes. Okay, let's get that right. Justin Capes, academic philosopher. Yeah, he's not really a good friend of mine, but like we've talked before, and his papers are fantastic, literally fantastic. And I've learned so much. I actually have his book right here, The Moral Responsibility and the Flicker of Freedom. Fantastic book on Frankfurt style examples. And he's an incompatibilist and he's a Christian. He's gone on the analytic Christian. So all that to say is there's some ethos there. He's a good philosopher. He actually has a master's from Biola in philosophy. Look at that, right? So
Right.
Well done. Okay. All that to say is he has an article, I think from Faith and Philosophy, published about a year ago on divine determinism. And I mentioned this because I think that is much better of an article to persuade someone that determinism is probably false. He argues that if determinism is true, then God lacks any standing to blame. So he could blame us, but he just doesn't. It's incoherent for him to blame us. It's kind of like the hypocrite objection.
Right.
I'm roughly right. I think the article is horrendous. I think it's terrible. Like, all I'm saying is I think that article, even though I think it's horrendous, is much better or it is in much better of a position to persuade somebody that divine determinism is false than the DoD is. Without a shadow of a doubt, easily. So that's what I want to say.
Well, and having not read the article, I do know briefly or vaguely of the objection just through other people. Other people have given a similar objection, and that it is a much better objection than the DoD deception argument. So
yeah, I think if no one has, it's a very expensive book, but it's called The Challenges of Divine Determinism by Peter Furlong. And he's actually an incompatibilist, but he was a raging incompatibilist before, did not believe in divine determinism, and then he basically, throughout his dissertation, wrote a book on it and everything, an entire book length, published in 2019 by Cambridge Press, on the cost of divine determinism and going through almost every single one of the popular objections to divine determinism there is. So the blameworthy objection, the love objection, the consequence arguments, the manipulation arguments. And then he also has the standing to blame argument. And essentially, long story short, he does, throughout his whole, research, he's found himself to be less convinced that determinism is problematic, even though he still remains an incompatibilist. He's just agnostic with regards to whether or not determinism is truly problematic. And I thought that was so telling and so fruitful. And he said that if I believe, don't quote me, but I believe towards the end of the standing to blame argument, which is, I think, probably the biggest nowadays contemporary argument against divine determinism. So if anyone's listening, if you want to search it up, Peter Furlong, The Challenges of Divine Determinism, and a host of other articles that I could mention, on this standing to blame objection. Those are much better arguments than this DoD.
And I would completely agree, at least in principle, because like I said, I haven't read that specific article. But now I'm going to, actually. So thanks for giving me some more reading.
The only other thing, if you're okay with it,
go ahead,
is to finally put this nail in the coffin on his main kicker, and that is, he briefly mentioned it in this response right here, that knowledge, therefore indeterminism, or knowledge, therefore divine determinism, has to be false. I specifically think he said knowledge, so therefore you cannot, if you're divinely determined, you cannot have knowledge via, it is metaphysically impossible for you to infer otherwise. I think that's what he actually said, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, he thinks, gives weight to premise 2, where Christians cannot have assurance of salvation. They can't know whether or not they're truly saved, and blah, blah, blah. So let's break down the argument and go into the epistemological weeds, because apparently Stratton thinks we don't go into the epistemological weeds and actually go into the argument, right? I have published this in volume 2, which was published 2 years ago or 3 years ago on Academia. You can download it for free, roughly in the aiming at truth objection, around page 230-ish. But I am going to quote from our dear friend, David Paulman, who's basically so well read in the epistemological literature that if anyone knows him, they know. And he has tons of videos on his YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason, so you can go ahead and check him out there. Mm-hmm. He says some very similar things in his video, why he doesn't agree with the free thinking argument. Essentially, here's my response. In order for Stratton to say that knowledge, therefore indeterminism, or if determinism is true, it is metaphysically impossible for me to know or think or infer otherwise, is really just a retelling, a repackaged version of the consequence argument. And so what I think he's doing is he's using the consequence argument, that intuition, which is perfectly valid, by the way. And that's like it's not valid that he doesn't adequately explain this. I have to piece it together myself, but I think he's using that to defend his premise too. So therefore, Christians cannot have assurance of salvation. God cannot be trusted. Blah 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 blah. And I think that quote that we just saw from him shows that, right? And so what he's trying to show is, if knowledge, it entails some sort of indeterministic metaphysical access. That's really what he wants to show, right? He wants to show that even if determinism were true, I don't have that kind of access. Now, first of all, I would like to say I think it's probably question begging. Okay, why do I need to have categorical access to those beliefs in the first place? And now he's not using that word, but he definitely means that word. And if he doesn't, I would like to kindly ask him why he doesn't think categorical and a categorical analysis is necessary here, or is illegitimate to be posited here on his behalf. When he talks about metaphysical impossibility for me to infer otherwise, that would only work via the consequence argument if the categorical analysis is the correct analysis of ability. So Bignon has done so much work on this topic in his 2018 book, Excusing Sinners, Blaming God, chapter 5. So feel free to look that up. But or in his rebuttal towards Stratton's Mere Molinism book in 2021. I can't remember when he published it. I think it's 2021 or 2020. I can't remember. But yeah, so I think in January 1st, 2021 is actually when Bignon published his 50-page response to Stratton's book, and he rehashes a lot of this stuff here. But all that to say is, I really don't think Stratton has given us any reason to think that because determinism is true, I can't metaphysically access certain reasons, epistemological reasons. So he's really just rehashing the consequence argument, which compatibilists have, of course, responses to. Literally, they have responses to. Now, he can come back and say, well, the conditional isn't really valid. And he has done that in the rejoinder that he published around March of 2021, 2 months after Bignon's rebuttal to him. And he's also kind of dipped his toes into the dispositional literature from the compatibilist side, using wide and narrow abilities from Vavellin's work. But I still don't think he doesn't even get close to hitting the mark. Here's what I think Paulman says, and well, he does say this, but I think it's the best possible response. When he says, Stratton, it's metaphysically impossible to infer otherwise, what does he mean by infer? Does he really mean inferential beliefs? Because it's not exactly clear all the time. Or does it mean non-inferential? And if he means non-inferential, that's just patently absurd. Because non-inferential beliefs, even among externalists with regards to epistemology and internalists with regards to epistemology, they would both virtually say those are incorrigible. There's no room for error. We do not choose non-inferential beliefs. If I see that my phone is red right in front of me, right, then I see redly is kind of the epistemological phrase that's used all the time. I can't be wrong that I do see red, or I can't be wrong that I am in pain. So they are justified immediately via direct acquaintance. Okay, so those cannot be wrong. So there's no judging or weighing those non-inferential beliefs. But I do think Stratton does mean to say inferential beliefs, but then what makes a reason good? How can I infer a good reason? Does it have anything to do with metaphysical access? And the answer is no. It has everything to do with whether or not the reasons justify my believing in them. If there is good evidence to believe something and my reasons are such that I look at this evidence and I weigh that evidence, then I am justified. Now, the way in which I weigh, tagging onto those verbs, Stratton wants to notoriously say every verb almost in determinism is illegitimate because it needs to have some sort of indeterministic access to weigh, to judge, to evaluate. And I say this patently absurd. It's not even been shown at all, ever, right? Besides maybe the consequence argument that is the case, that the determinist cannot access those reasons, that knowledge.
Right.
But then even then, obviously the determinist, the compatibilist can just go down the huge long line of decade responses from the compatibilist literature to counter the consequence argument. So I really don't find it. And since Stratton doesn't go into any of that literature, none of it, none, which is exactly one of Bignon's biggest hits in his 50-page rejoinder or 50-page rebuttal to his book, I find, man, that is true. To date, he doesn't go into any of that literature on the consequence argument, which is to me very, very telling. So this idea is, I think, if internalism is true, and internalism is just the idea that I can be directly aware of the reasons that justify my belief, internally aware of the reasons that justify my belief. I'm painting again with broad brushstrokes, but I think internalism is compatible with determinism. And just like what Paulman tries to argue against Stratton, that if S's epistemic justification, even if determinism were true, because both indeterminate internal awareness and determined internal awareness would still result in justification for believing some sort of proposition for S, that therefore entails that internalism is compatible with determinism. And what that means is that you can have access to knowledge, even if you were determined. The idea has to be with connection to reasons. It's the reasons and the evidence that justify something for an agent. It has nothing to do with metaphysical conditions. If you look at the very bare bone, stripped down internalism conditions, it really has an objective piece where it has to be non-arbitrarily connected to truth. And then it has to have a subjective piece directly aware of the reasons that you have. And it just so happens that Fisher and Revise's model of guidance control has a subjective component and an objective component. Wow. And they track so closely to being aware of the reasons and having good reasons to know why you believe what you believe in light of the evidence, even if everything was determined. So it just so happens that at least in internalism, if we take internalism, it does not entail the falsity of determinism. It just does not. I can hold to a very strong view of justification, namely internalism, and still have strong reasons, justify true belief, while being determined. Stratton goes into none of that. None of that. And now he might say, none of that matters. That's completely irrelevant because divine determinism, blah, 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 blah. I have yet to date have seen him go into the literature and try to piece together why internalism, those conditions on internalism necessitate an indeterministic condition. And if he says in response that it has to have an indeterministic condition because you wouldn't be able to metaphysically know anything or access anything, then that is straight up question begging, because the conclusion is that, and you're using the consequence argument to get there. So you cannot use the consequence argument in the premise to defend the conclusion, right? That or vice versa. Like you cannot do that's literally question begging. So I digress. I think that this whole argument, the DoD, really boils down to his free thinking argument, if knowledge, therefore indeterminism. But we are never really given a solid reason why indeterminism is necessary, apart from the consequence argument, which compatibilists have responses to.
And I want to add Nothing of substance because I couldn't add anything better than what you just had, but just two quick things. Again, guys, I highly recommend checking out David Paulman's Why I Don't Use the Free Thinking Argument, because I think that is a great video. And I get it. A lot of the guys who watch this channel are going to be Calvinists, going to be young earth creationists. You know, that we have a lot of disagreement with Paulman. First off, we have a lot of agreement with him. So
Yeah.
I watched a lot of his content, guys. Trust me. If you guys think the same way I do, you're going to have a lot of agreement with some of the stuff he says too. You can disagree with people. And another one of my favorite philosophers is Arthur Schopenhauer. And Arthur Schopenhauer is like a rabid atheist. So like, it's totally cool, right? But secondly, this video in particular, actually, and I watched it. I haven't watched it since it came out. But when he first came out with it, I believe it's like 2 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
Was actually it kickstarted first off my whole look into the DoD argument, because at that point I had only briefly heard of Stratton. And secondly, I still to this day think it is one of the best takedowns of the free thinking argument, especially by a layman, and a layman who is not a Calvinist, by the way,
Right.
that I've ever seen. And honestly, you could drop that layman part even if you wanted, because even, you know, a lot of the non-laymen who have responded to the free thinking argument, I think, are sometimes only coming close. I mean, David's a brilliant kid, man. I say kid, he's my same age, and I think he's actually a couple months older than me. But anyway, and the second thing I want to add to that is, on the same note you're bringing up here, right? How we don't have any justification for believing these claims that we can't have any epistemic knowledge. If knowledge, then indeterminism, right? I have also heard Phil Baer parrot these. I have also heard Kevin Thompson parrot these. Not that anybody should be listening to Kevin Thompson, but unfortunately a lot of you guys do. Leighton Flowers, even Jonathan Pritchett to a small extent. I say to a small extent because admittedly Pritchett is Pritchett might be my favorite popular non-Calvinist, because first off, he's it's hard to dislike the guy, and also he is a very intelligent individual. But I digress. I've heard Braxton Hunter bring him up. I've heard Warren McGrew bring him up, right? Tons of people who would consider themselves non-Calvinist or even anti-Calvinist bring up arguments related to, adjacent to, if not just the full-fledged free-thinking argument itself, this idea that knowledge equals incompatibilism in some sense. You got to back that up. You can't just, for all you guys, right? You can't just assume it. I'm not going to rehash all the reasons because I would do it more poorly and it'd convolute and all this other kind of stuff. So we're just going to let what Colton said hang. But I'd like to kind of to throw a little bit of a gauntlet down to all you guys, right? You have to defend that claim. You have to defend the claim that free will, that logic, that reason, that morality, all these things that you guys think, judgment, right? You brought up for Stratton, it's pretty much any verb, right? That they require a libertarian free will. You have to actually defend that. You can't just claim it and then assume you've won the debate, because you haven't at that point. You've done nothing more than argue. And as my friend Tyler Vela has often said, I've never heard an argument from a popular, emphasis on popular, anti-Calvinist for incompatibilism that doesn't simply assume incompatibilism. Kind of like exactly what you're saying there with question being, right? So I just like to respectfully and in Christian love call the rest of you guys to task here, not just Dr. Stratton. I think we can all collectively make these conversations go a lot farther by simply defining our terms and defending the claims, right? And maybe you guys still end up thinking that you have to have a libertarian free will in order for reason to actually be utilized. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But at the very least, you'll have an argument for it. And I'll get off my soapbox because like I said, I don't have anything else to add. And actually, I'm going to let this play a little tiny bit longer, but I think that we might actually be done here. Because if I remember correctly, he's just going to continue on with this appeal and talk a little bit about the conference he went to.
Yeah, I mean, I got it. No one was accused.
Yeah, he's talking about the conference there.
And I do enjoy having these conversations.
Waters. It's like being a Nebraska fan and then meeting someone who's our God, we should have a little bit of an age with those different types.
All right, yeah. There's nothing else to add here, so we're actually done. I'll let you end with any parting words you'd like, but that video is over, and yeah, I think this was a good job. I wish I was a little bit less tired because I feel like I've definitely done a lot of stutters and uhs and ums, but you guys have been a good audience, and you've been a wonderful guest as always. Go ahead, floor is yours.
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add is most of my work can be found on academia, just like CJ. And so if you don't want to, for instance, go stumble over to Paulman's Faith Because of Reason YouTube channel because he's not Calvinist, then download my work because I am Calvinist, and you can download it for free, although it's not in video format. But Volume 2 is where I systematically go through the free thinking argument and go through many of his responses, Strattons, rejoinders, or support systems of the free thinking argument, and I try to dismantle them, including intuition, the consequence argument, the mad scientist argument that he's often used before in the past, indirect doxastic voluntarism, all that fun stuff. And so aiming at truth objection. So it's not for the faint of heart. It's very philosophical. So, but yeah, thank you for having me, and it's been a blessing. It's been awesome.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I appreciate that the guests I have been having, you, Israel, Chris, Turton fan, there was a time when I first started this channel, it was a little bit of naivete, to be honest with you. It was also a little bit of, if I'm being completely real with everybody, of like, hey, that's a big name. Let's get him on. You know what I mean? There was a time where it was a 50-50 shot. Will the guest increase the amount of intellectualism on this channel? Will they increase will they push forward the search for truth? Or are we going to, start dogpiling on someone or getting a food fight or whatever, you know what I mean? And I appreciate that through, in a large part, through the efforts of guys like you and Chris and others who have joined me, that this channel has pivoted towards what I think is much more intellectual and, more importantly, much more edifying. Because ultimately the point here is to edify the body and to glorify Christ. And I think that it's better that it's better when we attempt to do those things by way of rationality, reason, which is kind of the same thing, I guess, good philosophy, good apologetics, good history, good theology, etc., etc. So I appreciate it, and yeah, you've been a huge blessing to this channel. So thank you very much. With that, friends, we're going to go ahead and tap out on this one. So if you like this video, please do remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified anytime we go live. If you want to leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything of that nature in the comment section down below, you are welcome to do so. Obviously, you got to be respectful. Don't be cussing, stuff like that. But I haven't had a problem with that so far. And considering what I've seen in the live chat, I don't think I'll have a problem with this particular batch of watchers. Of course, some people are going to watch this after it's live, but nevertheless, I think you guys are pretty good at that usually. If you'd like to follow us on any social media, I do have links to all my social media in the comment section down below. You can just find me at the Tag the Synagogue on any of these different places. I probably won't accept your personal Facebook friend request. So follow the actual, if you want to do it on Facebook, follow the actual Synagogue page, please. But anyways, also links to the Patreon if you guys want access to my breakfast tea video blogs. That, of course, also goes a long way in supporting the channel. 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered is also down there. And link to my article on the deity of deception argument, why Dr. Tim Stratton's DoD argument fails, which goes into much more depth than what we got into today if you're interested in a takedown of the DoD. That paper, I just got to say briefly, because I think a lot of people might be skeptical. Oh, some YouTuber publishing philosophy paper. How can I trust that? I have gotten some direct endorsement from Dr. Sean Gould, who's a philosophy professor at CWI. J.G. Klein, who is the former philosophy professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. Chris Date, who of course agrees with me, but nevertheless is a philosopher, not a philosopher, excuse me, a professor. I think he is, right? At Trinity Theological Seminary. Is that right? And I think that's all the only big names. We've gotten some other names on there as well. Colton said he likes some elements of it. Israel Trujillo said he likes some elements of it. So that, you know, and I don't say that because you guys need to accept it. I'm only saying that it's advertising. I'm gonna be honest. It's advertising because I want you guys to know I'm not just some schmuck who just decided, you know, technically any idiot with a Wikipedia account can edit Wikipedia, and also technically any idiot with a academia account can post in academia. But for the most part, to be honest, I haven't actually found that problem with academia, and Wikipedia got a lot better at policing their ranks too. So maybe that joke doesn't even hit anymore. Anyways, point is, please do consider checking that out. Lastly, but not leastly, Colton's academia account is also in the description below. Now, I have not read his 3 volumes. So I have read the first one, which has got like 1,000 views at this point, by the way. That's insanely awesome. But I haven't read second or third. I have read his response to the 1 Corinthians 10:13 issue. And I say this every time he's on. I've said it every time the question has come up. It is quite literally my favorite work on the topic. Please do consider checking it out, whether you're a libertarian or not. If you think 1 Corinthians 10:13 supports libertarian free will or you don't, either way, I think it is a brilliant article. It's about 75 pages, give or take, but well worth the read. And quite frankly, if you guys are out here reading, I mean, look at this. This is the size of some academic books. You can deal with 75 pages. You know what I mean? Anyways, God bless you guys. We love you in the Lord. And yeah, if the Lord wills and tarries, we will be here soon with something. Not quite sure what yet.
I said, won't it be a time?